Yeah.
It has cleared, so please do make sure you drive with care. And then just
For an
slowly
hour,
drive
it's
it
just you and
towards
me,
the
Tata.
cliff. That overturned vehicle
To
on the
me.
N1 South
Hey,
Again.
again.
affecting the
Imagine
crossing
a whole
lanes and
hour.
affecting the left as well. Do
But
update
I'm gonna be nice today.
if there's anything
Okay.
else, tweet
I'm
us
going to be
at
very
Okay.
nice.
987 traffic.
I'm your seventh today.
What's
So,
different?
University of Witwatersrand, Lumkile Mondi, Andrew Davidson, Head of Advice at Old Mutual Corporate Consultants, and Koliswa Malindini, Economics and Quantitative Methods Lecturer and Academic Director at the Wits School of Governance. Join the conversation on what the numbers suggest about the world of business in 2021. In Conversation with the Statistician-General is proudly brought to you by Power 98.7 in association with Old Mutual, On the Money, and Mail and Guardian. Now we are talking. Hashtag Power Business. Hashtag On the Money Talks.
When you succeed, we succeed. That's why we are proud to be a platinum sponsor of the South Africa Investment Conference. As one of SA's largest investors, we're increasing our 5-year commitment to 100 billion rand by 2022. Our roots have run deep in South Africa for more than 100 years. Let's keep growing together. Anglo-American, real mining, real people, real difference.
They say that the grass is always greener on the other side, but the kicker is, if you take time to tend to your own, it'll be just as green. Therefore, we call on you, Mzansi. We need you. Your city needs you. South Africa needs you. The provision of municipal services such as electricity, water and sanitation depend on you. When service delivery is done right, it solves everyday problems that optimize resources and allow South Africa to grow. In order to do this, your municipality needs your support as a responsible citizen to improve service delivery. Your municipality is your responsibility. Do the right thing. Be a responsible citizen. Pay your municipal services. A message from government.
Send us your voice notes on 083 303 7093.
Hey, Braditi, Piron and Alex. The thing with friendship is that somebody always wants to benefit something from it. So you can't just, be closest to the person without actually getting anything out of that particular friendship, be it a business deal or be it a shoulder to cry on. So a friend is, to me, somebody that would be there for you
Did you get
when
something
you
out
need
of?
them the most, but genuinely so. But these days are very, very few, actually. Sure.
Like, if you can't do anything for me, we can't be friends.
Afternoon, TT. The very same Zuma who have always says, I want my day in court. I want to answer for myself. I want my day in court. Is the very same Zuma now that is running away from answering question or from coming and take responsibility, coming to account for what has been said, because he's been implicated by more than 30 witnesses. Now he doesn't want to answer. He's running away from the justice. It's very embarrassing. The person whom we used to call the president is Isaac Sidumedi here. Thank you.
Thank you, Murutis Dumedi. There, a quick tweet to end off with here. Zukisi Twitter says that these lawyers are either draining or sinking the old man. Is Mr. Mabuza suggesting that the DCJ is lying when he says the man walked out without permission? They aren't correctly advising the man, but killing his reputation. Hatebe says Mabuza is weak. He's unable to answer questions that and help us understand what the law says. Abantu bagazuma kodwa. No, he's not weak. I think it was a very deliberate ploy for him not to answer my questions directly.
Good afternoon, teacher and the listeners. This is Dion from Sishiko. Look, Ubaba getting out or walking out of a commission, he was confused. These things, they do happen, especially when you are in sittings like that and you see things not going your way, you end up being confused. So he did that unintentionally so. He never intended to walk out. The quick confusion, according to my judgment.
Okay.
Dion from Sishiko. That's how I saw it.
Baby, I'm so confused.
It's a step to 6 o'clock. Up next will be Power Business after the latest news.
Power News.
In the top stories this hour, Reserve Bank Governor says the resurgence of COVID-19 in the country's trading partners will impact growth of the economy, and Jacob Zuma's legal team to have reviewed Zondo Inquiry Head's ruling on its recusal application. Good evening, Amananda Khomo. Reserve Bank Governor Lesija Kganyago says the COVID-19 vaccines will help the global economy recover. However, he adds that markets are currently focused on the second wave of COVID-19 cases in the US and Europe. Several countries have instituted new lockdowns. Year. Kganyago says the renewed lockdowns in some of South Africa's largest trading partners, such as the UK, will impact on growth.
The jury is still out, and I don't think that the markets just respond to what happens in the US. They respond to all sorts of events, and at the moment, I think high on the agenda or high in the top of the minds of many investors is what is going to be the impact of the second wave of infections that we have seen in the northern hemisphere.
Meanwhile, the Reserve Bank improved its growth forecast for the year to a contraction of 8% from a previous 8.2% forecast. Former President Jacob Zuma's legal team says it will apply for a review of the Zondo Inquiry chair not to recuse himself when Zuma testifies. He was summoned to answer questions related to allegations of fraud and corruption in the public sector. However, he raised issue with the independence and fairness of the Commission's chairperson, Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, citing a personal relationship between them. Zondo today dismissed Zuma's application, saying the grounds put to him warranted no such outcome.
In the end, I conclude, having had regard to all the points that have been raised by the applicant, including the points relating to press statements and media conferences that he has referred to in his affidavit, I conclude that the applicant has failed to meet the test for a reasonable apprehension of bias.
Zuma and his lawyers then walked out of the commission despite summons compelling him to take the witness stand.
It is a pity that he has elected to leave without asking for permission. There is no point for the commission to sit for the rest of the day because it had convened to deal with his evidence. There is no point in coming tomorrow because he's not coming back.
Legal analyst Rebecca Sabanda says that Zuma is opening himself up to another criminal charge, adding to a list of charges already against him.
Right now, the former president and his lawyers have walked out, and they cannot unilaterally excuse themselves. You know, they have not received permission from the Deputy Chief Justice, and they run the risk of being charged with contempt, which is a criminal offense.
And in news just coming in, reports are suggesting that Malawian court has ordered the release of the Bushiris. They had gone to a court in their home country in connection with the extradition by South African officials. Now, Justice and Correctional Services Minister Ronald Lamula says that a full extradition request will be filed in the next 2 weeks in an attempt to get the Bushiris back in the country to face trial. During a post-cabinet briefing earlier, Lamula said he's confident that the couple will be brought back, adding that they will get a a fair trial. He has admitted, though, that the process will take long. The security cluster is also expected to release details around how they left the country. Power News reporter Risenga Maluleke has more.
Justice and Correctional Services Minister Ronald Lamola says the South African government now has a month to bring forward a formal extradition request to the government of Malawi.
The provisional arrest kickstarts the process of extradition. And when the provisional arrest has been issued and acted upon, we're expected as South Africa to then submit the full extradition request within the 30 days after the fugitive has been arrested.
The minister says he hopes that this process will be concluded within 14 days.
And I must take pains to explain why that process may take some time, although we've given them a time of 2 weeks to do it. It needs to state with particularity the charges the fugitives are facing, the investigation, at which stage is the investigation.
He says he's confident that Bushiri will eventually return to the country to face the music.
From our perspective, with all the information at our disposal, we are convinced that the Bushiris will come back to South Africa to stand trial, and they are guaranteed a fair trial in our country.
Risenga Maluleke, Power News, Pretoria.
In the markets this hour, the rand was last trading at 15 rand 56 to the US dollar, 20 rand 57 to the pound, and 18 rand 41 to the euro. Gold was last trading at $1,858, 2 cents an ounce, and Brent crude oil at $44.28 a barrel. A cool and fine day is expected across Gauteng tomorrow. Temperatures peaking at 25 degrees in Johannesburg, 27 in Pretoria, and 26 in Vereeniging. Recapping the top story in Power News this hour, in reports coming from Malawi, a court has granted that Pastor Shepherd Bushiri and his wife Mary be released on bail.
Power News. Power to the courageous souls, the spiritual teleporters, them who raise future leaders while shaping leaders' futures all in a day's work. Leaders in their own right. The crowd shaker, the groundbreaker. We say power to you, the harmonic melodic airbender, the platform taker, the voice of reason, the perception shifter, the sister and brother from another mother. The time has come to dial into a frequency that allows you to really be you. To you we say power. Power 98.7. Now we're talking.
When something big happens, we spread the word and tell the world. Power 98.7. Now we're talking. Power Business with Tumisang Ndlovu. Monday to Thursday, 6 to 8 p.m. and Fridays, 6 to 7 p.m. on Power 98.7.
Khulu Dumelang, as always, and welcome to the third installment of the Old Mutual On the Money Talks, of course, in partnership with us right here on Power 98.7. We are live as well as Power Business on our sister station, Capricorn FM. Tonight, we are going to be talking about all things statistical data, how that affects the economy, as well as you and I and our pockets, particularly in a time of a global pandemic that is COVID-19. Do get in touch with us because our guest is none other than Risenga Maluleke, the statistician-general. It's not very normal that we have him for a full 2 hours, and today, as he jokes, I abuse him. I certainly don't. We are just going to ask questions that are going to be relevant to what it is that we need to know at a business level, an economic level, at a point that it hits both of us at statistical measure and the so-called economic reform that is always sought in South Africa. Stay tuned. After the break, we get all the details.
Old Mutual's On the Money program. Old Mutual Life Assurance Company SA Limited is a licensed FSP.
Allow me to take this time to greet the Statistician-General of South Africa. Tatan, riperile, as you and I always say.
Riperile to me, and again, greetings to the listeners.
Minjan.
Ipukile mnjani?
COVID-19, hayi utshware ka bothata.
Well. It affects everyone in the society. I guess it affects us one way, directly or indirectly.
And I know you hate going into the personal side of the makeup of the man in the office of the Statistician-General because you work with a team, you work within a space that is mandated, and I think that's where I want us to start, the mandate of the Statistician-General's office. The data that we often get, we have a disconnect in that not all of us have the acumen to look at the data and not be emotional about it. Talk to us about the direct mandate of your office.
The direct mandate of the Statistician General is drawn from the Statistics Act, Act number 6 of 1999, which empowers the Statistician General for the country as well as the head of the country to collect, store and analyze as well as disseminate information to the public, and doing so impartially. That is, there is no favor and prejudice to any form of the work that we do. Of course, the Statistician General stands on the shoulders of powerful men and women of different ages who have all sorts of expertise. I'm just their mouthpiece. They actually do a lot of the work and they are competent in their own right, for which we owe this interview and have to dedicate it to them. But let me also come to the fact that in the work of the Statistician General, there has to be a lot of independence. The Statistics Act directs us to have 3 institutions. That is the minister, and in this case, the Statistician General reports to the minister in the presidency. There is also the South African Statistics Council, which is entirely independent of both the minister and the Statistician General, which safeguards official statistics and advises both the minister and the Statistician General. We can choose to take such advice, and at times we may not. The relationship doesn't have to be a friendly one. Rather, it should be cordial, and we should keep each other focusing on our work. On the work of the Statistician General, in as much as the Statistician General takes advice, the independence and integrity of the numbers is very critical. So the numbers, when we make them available, you cannot have pre-sight from any person. And if you look, we're a government department, and then the times with matters of government, you usually see that they get discussed at the ministerial level or at the level of a cabinet before a statement is issued. It's not the same with statistics. We have about 250 to 270 products per annum. Almost every day we have a product going out.
Sure.
And in that regard, they must be released independent to maintain integrity. And in doing so, as we make them available, we try and make sure that we explain the methods, and we usually publish our methods in our reports so that we can make the public understand what we are doing. Policymakers in the form of parliamentarians and politicians and those in the executive, as well as leaders and captains of industry, they see the numbers the same time as members of the public see them. And that maintains the independence. And when you have independence, to me, you have a big responsibility because you have to get it always right the first time. There is no going back.
That's what I find interesting in that the independence of the Statistician General's office has been hard fought for. Likewise with the independence of the Reserve Bank, and one could see the similarities there. When we talk about those who are policymakers, sometimes they are politicians. And it is quite important and vital to have an office and an individual that is steadfast in saying, this is statistical and this is emotional, and you do that quite well. Where's the makeup in the fiber that is you that says no?
To me, it's very complex. There are times when statisticians all over the world are stretched to the limits, to a point where they are asked to comment even on policy matters, to dabble into the policy space. Unfortunately, this is not the game that you can get your hand into the policy space. You sit with numbers. And because you sit with numbers, everyone says this person has insight. And the discipline and the restraint to have to maintain such a constraint not to enter into the policy space becomes very, very critical, in a sense that as you do so, you can't have taste buds. We sometimes have numbers. I hear, including yourself to me when you interview me, I hear commentators quite often saying the numbers are looking too good or too bad. For the statistician-general, there's nothing too good or too bad. All of them are numbers. As long as we can explain them methodologically and be able to, we don't have to defend them at all times, but methods can give you any number. So what happens is when you go into collection and you have a particular method you are following, any number will come out.
Yeah.
So you can't be emotionally attached to numbers. You can't even be emotionally attached to the implications of those numbers in society. But one thing we know is that these numbers are about human life, and human life has equal worth. And we follow human life from beginning to end. When you are born, we are there.
Yeah.
We are able to tell South Africans how many children are born. About 1.2 million children are born.
And how many of us die?
Of course, about 500, in the excess of 500,000, 43,000 almost, who die per annum. And we have to tell South Africans what is taking the lives of South Africans. We should be able to say that hypertension is a lead cause in terms of the causes of death. We should be able to say that amongst women, diabetes mellitus is actually the main cause of death, and it's actually the years at which we see it coming in. It's creeping, it's going down from your ages of about 50s to about 45 years, 40 to 45 years. Amongst males, we see tuberculosis taking the lives of South Africans, and it's even declining from your 30s right down to about ages of 25 to 29 years.
And that's where the statistical data, even at a basis of human life, relates to the economics of the landscape of how a country functions at an economical level, because we are all economic participants. Whether one has a job or does not, they are a participant of the economic cycle of South Africa. And where I feel, and that's a selfish view on my side, that at times we look at statistical data and think, this doesn't relate to me, so I do not have to look at it. At what point is it the role of Stats SA to make us as a South African public meet a marriage of minds with statistical data to find ourselves within a playing field of an economic climate?
It is like going to ask sugar to me whether sugar and the particles of coffee are the final product of the makeup of coffee that we drink. You can't separate them in the end. So what we do is we collect information about everyone. We go, and the information we have is a lot. It's like the strands of hair on the buffalo skin. It's like the pebbles of sand sitting out there on a seabed. We have volumes and volumes of data. Once we have that, we go through a serious number crunching. And once we have done that, then we come up with aggregates and averages. In that case, you can no longer see a Tumisang Ndlovu or a Risenga Maluleke.
Yeah.
You can't separate them. But one of the things we have to do is to protect the identity of those that we collect the information from, because you cannot, in official statistics, identify the respondents. So the law of averages, the law of aggregates says, in official statistics, says that you have to protect the confidentiality of those that you collect data from. For example, when we collect a lot of information about people's lives and personal circumstances, their income, and we don't run to our friends at SARS. Of course, the SARS commissioner is a good friend of mine, but the friendship ends as much as we work institutionally. It's actually data that we get from SARS that enters Stats SA. Data from Stats SA doesn't go back to SARS. So we can't go and say, to me, she earns this amount, and then she hasn't been paying her tax, and please run after her. We can't do that. We don't promote lawlessness in any country, but we collect information from all people within the borders of South Africa. And there are those who are even in the country illegally. So it's not our job to go and track them down, but it's our job to collect information from them. So other than collecting information at a personal level, we collect information from entities, from the business side of things. So we should be able to say, this is how industry is behaving. So if there are 3 industries or less we can't make such information available because it's easy for one, if there are 3 firms or less, we can't make such information available practicing in a similar industry. Because what happens is it's easy for one firm to go and remove all their numbers and their information, and they can actually be able to estimate what how the others are performing. And that can be bad for fair competition in the business space.
It also speaks to rigging the numbers, and it brings us to my next question, that at what level do you then collate data? How do you do so? Crunch the numbers down and then deem it credible to release to a South African public?
We do it in 2 ways. One is we go to households. Firstly is that official statistics is about what happens in society, be it at an individual level or household level, or at an institutional level or an entity in the form of a business. Now, let us go back to a household level. Prior to COVID-19, we would work with pen and paper in what we call PAPI, paper-assisted personal interviews. We were migrating to what we call computer-assisted personal interviews, that we call it CAPI. And as we do so, and that migration has been occurring in most of our surveys, as we do so, we would have our field workers coming to your household and they sit with you, capture all the information that we need to capture based on the emphasis of a survey, be it a quarterly labor force survey, income and expenditure survey, or any other survey, domestic, national transport survey or something like that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we go to business entities. And because business entities are much more organized, so they send us their information. There are cases where we have to follow up with them and make them explain. And we usually do that on the phone. But there are times when we have to visit them because we have to maintain relationships and make sure that we assist them. Over time, and we should understand, most of our surveys from the social side and the household side are fairly new in the form that is inclusive of the entire society. Most of them have emerged after 1994. Whereas on the business side, we have more than 7 decades of collection of official statistics from the side of business.
Why do we collate data? For the purposes of one, economic transformation, economic development, as well as seeking to assist policymakers to ensure that there is the correct policy to follow to direct an economic landscape that is going to be beneficial for all.
For starters, let me admit that government is the biggest user of our information. But government is not our only focus. When we make information available, we make it equally available to members of the society. We might not see it as much. People in the academia use our information a lot. Students use our information. Business people, including emerging business people, use our information a lot. When you do the feasibility for those who want to venture into business, you have to understand what landscape in terms of an economic landscape you are in, what kind of customers will you have, what are their earning patterns, what are their levels of earnings and the like. So one of the things that we do is to provide information for purposes of planning broadly at the national level. Largely, from a government side, we have planning in the form of the National Development Plan, but even prior to that, planning continued. We also have monitoring and evaluation. But from the side of the citizenry, there is a need to hold those that are in office accountable using evidence. So the whole issue of empirical evidence being used in inculcating a culture of evidence-based policy formulation, decision-making and the like is very critical in the use of numbers.
Here's where I'm going to get uncomfortable, and I know you don't like it, and I know you expect it from me. In that I spoke to Rep Luhutla on Power Business not so long ago, about 2 months ago. And now that he's out of office, he's able to share even far more than he would be able to when he was in office. And he was quite blatant to say that at times he feels that government is not using the statistical data in a manner that it should be used currently. There are times where loopholes exist. In your time in office, have you found that government, the state currently, is using this data correctly? And I ask this question solely because when we have the quarterly labor force survey, you and I banter about it that we sometimes miss the good side of the numbers and we focus on the bad. And the media is lambasted for that because we focus on the unemployment rate as opposed to where employment was generated. There's a disconnect between citizenry and the numbers. Where are we missing the parts that we need to find out about?
Firstly, it is true that empirical evidence is not used as much in making our decisions, not only here in South Africa, all over the world. You see policymakers making policy positions, and at times you look at the evidence, it's indicating something else. So it is incumbent upon those of us who are in the state of practice, of official practice of production of statistics, to keep on taking the numbers to them. In the olden days, you used to have what we call supply-driven approach, where you take numbers to policymakers and you flood the markets and they sometimes then got overwhelmed. But now what we are creating, we want a culture of demand-driven. So we have to create a value in the numbers. And to create a value is to always be knocking at the door and say, these are the numbers that will actually address your problems. There are times when, by the time we respond to them, they've already made certain policy positions. And you need to always say that when you tweak those policy positions, always use the numbers. I mean, look at COVID-19 all over the world. Progress that has been made by different nations has been made on the basis of numbers being used. Almost everyone today wants to go on their machine and go on Worldometer to check what is the position of our country, how many people are dying, how many people are infected, how many people are critical. We have seen the value of numbers. So there are times when we must take advantage of situations that require the use of numbers and make sure that such numbers are made available. Having said so, you need the maturity of both the statistical system as well as the policy-making system to go together into what we call evidence-based policy formulation. Because if one matures than the other, you end up with what you call evidence-influenced policy formulation. That is only as and when evidence is needed. And you don't want that. Now, we have a new democracy. It's about a quarter a century old. It's the same with StatSA. And the maturity through which these institutions, on the policy side and the business side, as well as on the statistical side, find each other to be able to work together in terms of making the numbers available is very critical. As that happens, the statistics in the form of official statistics must always maintain their independence.
Maintaining the independence, there's a trust deficit within citizenry and the state. It has been alive for quite a number of years in South Africa, given irregularities, given alleged corruption. When we do get certain numbers, we question whether are they collected in a manner that we are able to trust as a South African citizenry. How do you debate that within your office?
The issue of trust of the trust between citizenry and authority is not an issue that is phenomenal for South Africa alone. It is all over. Every day we see footages of civil disobedience by members of the public across the globe. Even in regions in Asia where we didn't see much of civil disobedience, we have seen in recent times the developments in Hong Kong and are actually mimicking what we have seen in the Middle East as far as the Mid-Americas. So this issue has always been there. And where numbers come in and argue for their space in independence, one is the practice by those of us in the official space of the numbers to always demonstrate, one, in the manner in which we collect information, and make sure that there is no interference on our methods. And when there is no interference, and that that space where we stand alone and there is no interference, we must always demonstrate it. Beyond that, when we have the crunching of the numbers occurs in the background. But when we finally make those numbers available, we have to release them at a time we determine on our own. And when we determine the time, nobody can come and tell us that you can't release these numbers on this particular day. For example, we have had situations where the president was answering questions in Parliament in the afternoon, and we were making numbers available on the quarterly labor force survey or GDP in the morning.
It was not going to look good.
And no, we have continued to make our numbers available regardless, because our program cannot be influenced by what policymakers are doing. We can only change our dates only if the numbers do not make sense, number one, and we need to give confidence to the numbers, or if there's something technical in nature, but we must do so independently. I've received a letter from the Speaker of Parliament, even previously, to say, we are aware you are releasing the GDP on this day, and you are aware the President is addressing the nation. I've said, thank you very much for the letter. And it's not done out of disrespect.
Yes.
It's done for purposes of maintaining independence of the numbers. Once that is demonstrated, and the continued distance between us and policymakers, half the time, as I've indicated earlier, when issues are discussed in government, they go through cabinet first. Official numbers don't go through cabinet. When we make them available, they are released at the same time like any other, and the policymakers and even the president, he receives them at the same time like any other person receives them. Having said so, there's never been attempts by those in the policy space or in the political space, be it parliament or the executive, to prevail on the statistician-general to make numbers early or to not to make numbers available or to delay for purposes of political expediency. It has never happened. But even if it would happen at any given moment, I would not allow it to happen, because I have been asked to defend the independence of official numbers. That's what I've been hired for. And this is what the law of this country protects the statistician-general, and indeed states say to do.
And at that personal level, we must also talk about the makeup of a statistician-general. What qualities does one need to have to stand their ground? I mean, at times, when CPI comes out, it's usually a couple of days or the day before the finance minister delivers some sort of an announcement, particularly an MTBPS or a big budget, or the Reserve Bank is having their monetary policy committee meeting. And you get questions around, well, okay, we're doing all right in terms of inflation, and therefore it propels what the South African Reserve Bank is going to say the next day or the following day. Therefore, you will get those questions. And I'm interested in finding out the makeup of that no-nonsense stance of saying, I am hired by these regulations to do 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I'm going to stand my ground in a political dispensation such as the South African economy.
To me, I've always told you statisticians have no taste buds. You can say it as a commentator that it's a nonsense stance. With us as statisticians, we're just doing our work. And it doesn't matter where you are. But back to the issues in terms of the makeup of the statistician-general. Firstly, the statistician-general must have acquired the expertise and the skills to hold such an office in the form of a necessary training that should have occurred. Be it in statistics, mathematics, economics, geography, social sciences, but with an emphasis towards an appreciation of numbers, but not only numbers, from an official point of view, because some of the statistics that we learn at university doesn't deal with compilation, the compilation part of official statistics. Some of them you learn on the job. I've spent almost 3 decades in the field of statistics in my life. So members of management in Stats SA actually in the same space, having spent almost 3 decades in the field of statistics. And not only ourselves. In Canada, for example, the average years of those that were in office was 32 years. So they start their life there and end it there. That is number one. Number two is that we must understand the environment within which we operate. For example, at a global level, we have what we call the United Nations Fundamental Principles of Official Statistics. that guide us on what we can do and what we cannot do.
Okay.
And the space within which we operate to draw enough respect amongst our peers. I'm pleased to say that Statistics South Africa is being called upon from time to time, not only on the continent, but even globally, to express our opinion. Nothing gets discussed on matters statistics the world over without Statistics South Africa expressing its opinion. And that's a great respect that we have earned, not for the statistician-general, for the men and women in Stats SA who we usually deploy across the world to speak or to discuss issues on our behalf as a country. At a continental level, we have what we call the African Statistics Charter. This directs us on what we can do and what we cannot do, especially on a continent like ours, where statistics are needed more for developmental purposes other than in the developed world in the West. Then here in South Africa, you have the Statistics Act that protects us. But beyond that, a statistician in office must be able to balance not only the technical side of issues, we must be able to understand the social space in which we are. And of course, because every statistical agency in every country draws its national law or legislation within the construct of a political space within that country, be it a unitary state or otherwise, be it a federal state, and otherwise, what kind of executive powers do you have in the president or the people at play? As a statistician or chief statistician of a country, you must appreciate and understand those things. And you need to know and understand when to stand your ground, including in the space of politics. And that is done with a lot of respect. It's not an on-your-face approach.
Yeah.
It's done with a lot of respect, but we have work to do. And as statisticians and in Stats SA, we are always very proud of the work that we do, even in the space of a developing nation like ours.
How closely then does the Stats SA office work with National Treasury as well as the Presidential Office when it comes to developing economic strategy based on numbers?
Firstly, Stats SA is within the presidency. The statistician-general reports to the minister in the presidency, Mr. Jackson Mthembu. But the reporting is an administrative one for political issues of reporting through parliament and the like. On methods, we stand alone. When policies are being looked at, the development of the National Development Plan, for example, the compilation of such plans, and any other issues, we assist at an arm's length. We only appear there when data is needed. We cannot be there when these discussions are made. And there is a reason why we can't be there. For example, the Division of Revenue Act, the DORA, you use a lot of statistics. You have to know which province has the highest number of people. From the Financial and Fiscal Commission side, and if you look at, the constitution of our country, if you look at section 219 A to J, it talks about progressive realization of the state from the side of the spheres of government, and from local to district, all the way to province and national. One of the things that it draws you to is that in the division of revenue, the population side plays a critical role. So we need to know as a country which province has the highest number of people, and in what state do they find themselves, where do they live and play. That is number one. So the DORA needs that. But beyond that, and of course, if you look at what we supply, we have to do so at an arm's length. Why do we need to do so? The statistician-general could easily sit in there and say, I have all the numbers. Let me throw the bones and tell you what you need to do in future. But because the economy and the markets behave in a particular way, let us look at the GDP, for example. We have to measure it quarterly because it changes. Nobody knew as of the 1st of January that would have COVID-19 hitting us in the way it has affected
and so
us as the world.
soon the Reserve Bank would be revising those numbers up.
Certainly. So as we do so, if we were to sit there and say, go and do this and do this to policymakers, and they do exactly what we advise them to do, and later the numbers change because markets are actually susceptible to shocks both internally and externally. And the numbers don't confirm what we advise them to do. We would shy away from releasing those numbers in the future, which confirm what we against what we advise them. And once we shy away, we have lost our independence. And there is no statistician-general the world over who aspires to lose their independence, because they will have no respect amongst their peers.
It becomes a very tricky balance, and I want to ask, where then do revisions occur, and how then do you collate that here we need to rectify?
Firstly, it's two levels. One is that there are times when statistics agencies all over the world have found the numbers and not gotten them right.
Fair.
In our case in South Africa in 2003, we have the CPI debacle. We have the manufacturing side that has hit us. But if you go to the United States, for example, they even had to put a commission, the Boschini Commission, to look at the issue, particularly on the prices of TVs and refrigerators that they had actually gotten wrong all over time. So when you look at that, and even beyond that, Hungary had to put in place a commission to look at how numbers have been gotten wrong. Amongst other things that we have a responsibility to do as statisticians is that when we have gotten a number wrong, and the users have indicated to us, we must be the first ones to admit. Because this is not a game of trying to try and look smart. These numbers are about human life. They're about the behavior and conduct of entities in the industry. Now, you have to always make sure that when you are pointed at something, you need to stand up and say, here we didn't understand it well. We will deal with it, and we'll deal with it appropriately in the way it has to be done. But now, coming back to issues now, when you look at those numbers, firstly, we are always the first ones when numbers do not make sense. For example, we just collected the QLFS using the computer-assisted telephone interviews, CATI. And because we're only using those numbers, that people that had telephones, when the numbers came to us, they had a bias because towards people who had telephones all over the country. And we could say, where are the people? About the people with telephones were about 62% of our sample. And about 75% were in Mpumalanga, 49%, which was the lowest, were in the Northern Cape. That introduced the bias. We were the first ones to say we are not making the numbers available. You kept on calling us from Power FM and say, where are the quarterly labor force numbers? And we said we are not making them available because we are still working on the veracity of the numbers that when we make them available, we are sure they will stand the test of time. And in this regard, when there is a bias, we have to iron out or phase out the bias by using the last quarter of, the first quarter of 2020, which had been the last quarter which we collected having a full sample. And this happens from time to time. There are times when we also go into revisions. If you look at the first quarter, for example, of the GDP, we had returned a negative growth of, a growth of -2%.
Yes.
With new information, we came back and said, now we are revising to negative 1.8% as a growth rate. So revisions are part and parcel of the work of statisticians all over the world, reporting on issues of not only revisions, but also rebasing, getting new information that you need to include, including in your basket of goods and services, is part and parcel of statistical offices in the world. Also indicating the confidence level at which we are operating, to say we are 95% sure that these numbers will stand the test of time. And even the error of estimation. There was a case one time, we said the error of estimation is seated at this level. The next day, the headline, the newspaper headline says, errors in official numbers. It doesn't mean that. We just have to tell the nation that this is how far we are standing. Even in the census, we sometimes have what we call the undercount. How many people have we missed? We are one of the 5 countries in the world that estimate the undercount. And this allows us to be able to use it to estimate the final population figure based on the number of people that we have missed. And these are the information that we make available at all times. So we are the first ones to explain what happens in the kitchen.
That explanation sometimes gets Stats SA in a bit of a sticky situation where criticism comes in that why is there a revision? Number two, at what credible level do we take the number? And also, as an ordinary South African citizen, how does it affect my basket of bread, milk, eggs, and so forth? Is there a disconnect in communicating to South African consumers and citizenry that this data actually collates your day-to-day life?
For starters, let me mention that controversy and raising questions about official numbers is a very critical fabric of the life of an official statistical agency. No statistician in official practice should shy away to be taken to task on the numbers that they make available. Because it's only through that we are able to explain things a lot more clearer. But it's only through that we are able to educate. We have to continue educating at all times. But it's also through that we must refine our methods from time to time. Of course, we have user groups that we approach and work with them, and they raise issues, and we look at new information, new technologies coming. But official statistics is like an elephant. It takes long to turn. Because if we were turning at every corner based on what is happening, there is COVID-19 today, we need to change our methods and everything, and then COVID-19 will disappear, and then we have to go back to old methods and the like. It wouldn't work. So it takes long to turn, because official statistics about long-term planning. The day-to-day planning, while we use official numbers as a basis, you need what you call management information systems. That's why companies, firms, and even government departments have to look, the Department of Home Affairs has to look at the volumes of people arriving every day at their offices to make decisions as to whether they must expand the space or increase the number of employees. You don't need the statistician-general to tell you that. And in this regard, as we do so, from time to time, we'll be taken to task on the numbers that we make available. But it's our job to continue explaining that. But there are times when even we ourselves, not here in South Africa, do not explain sufficiently enough. And I'll give you an example. South Africans woke up in, as we reported, the second quarter of 2020 on unemployment.
Yes.
We were used to unemployment rising steadily from the upper 29% all the way to the 30s. And everyone was saying, now there is COVID-19. We expect unemployment to rise. And we came back and said, unemployment is sitting at 23.3%. And it had dropped in what you would call a creeping in of an artificial space which the world found itself in. And when we went back to the public and said, we measure what has happened in society.
And the terminology is also a problem, because there's a disconnect in the communication of the terminology, that in the private sector or in the government sector, so much employment has been recorded. Manufacturing is one of the industries that actually collated most of the growth. And then there was a problem that how do we then define these ones that are non-job seekers?
Well, the explanation, we might miss each other in the explanation, but the terminology has never been a problem. It's like when you are looking up at the sky and it's clear in a day and you say the sun is the problem. The sun will always be there. The terminology will always be there, and the technical jargon of the terminology will always be there. The work remains with us to explain it better. For example, we consider a person unemployed when they are actively looking for employment. So when, for example, during COVID-19, people were seated at home and were not actively looking for employment, they were not considered as unemployed. And in this regard, that is why our unemployment rate dropped. And we saw this only and all over the world. Only 2 countries didn't show that in the world. That was Canada and the United States. And if you look, they didn't have as much stringent measures of closing down on the movement like we have had in other parts of the world.
That is quite interesting, because then it becomes the job of the Stats SA office to communicate in a clear manner, and us as the media, then we ask antagonizing questions, and sometimes we do get it wrong in that we ask the wrong questions and then disseminate information that may not be layered in statistical methodology, but just in layman terms. To what extent do we work closely in industry, particularly where financial journalism comes in that by the time we release the data as Stats SA, by the time Ed Tumisang on Power Business says, this is what the data looks like and speaks to the statistician-general, but you and I will then have a disconnect because I think I'm trying to be smart and you are just dealing with the non-emotional side of giving data to the nation.
The antagonistic way between journalists and commentators and those in official practice and indeed in Stats SA cannot be the defining way of our relationship. From our side as Stats SA, we never feel the antagonism. No matter how much hard you think you are beating us, we never feel the antagonism. Actually, you actually rev us even more to be able to respond to issues of national importance as regards numbers. And in this regard, we used to do in the past where we used to bring journalists and key commentators for training at Stats SA on numbers and what they mean. We haven't done so in recent times for a very long time. And it might be time that we go back to that.
Yeah.
And we say, when you get a number, this is what it means. We usually allow them to come a day that when we release numbers, and they sit there and we brief them and explain to them. But it's not enough. We need to build such capacity so that we don't need to speak the same language. We want journalists to remain to be journalists and take us to task, even on things they understand, so that we can explain our work in even with the sharpness it requires and sharpen the understanding amongst members of the society. So that relationship will always be there because we want journalists to be independent and journalists want us as statisticians to be independent as ever.
We are a young democracy still. I may be criticized for even saying that after so many years, but what state did you find Stats SA in, following in the footsteps of one who was very hands-on, one who was out there in the public, but still maintained and towed the line of the independence of that office?
There has been a notion in public that when the previous statistician-general left office, he left no people in Stats SA.
Ne?
and I'm saying that's a fallacy.
Yeah.
Because the people that he has left in Stats SA are people he has worked with for a number of years. I've worked with Padile Utla for about quarter of a century. I've worked with Padile Utla for 25 years. And I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
Many people in Stats SA have worked with him. So the departure of any leader at any given moment cannot be the defining moment of the success of an organization. And I'm not talking about Stats SA. I'm talking about in general. Because organizations have a way that they reconstruct themselves when a leader departs. But when I came into Stats SA to take over Stats SA, one of the things that was quite challenging was that since October 2016, we haven't been able to hire a single staff member owing to the lack of financial resources. So the limitations that I had was to have to work with staff members that were drying up. And when you lose staff members in every organization, the ones that you lose are the ones that are actually demanded and poached by agencies. And amongst them are the best. And of course, those who remain in Stats SA are amongst the best of the best still. So when you remain with a smaller number of staff members, you have to stretch them beyond the limits to be able to do work. For example, as we are sitting now, you have people who are acting in one area and doing work. They are doing their work and acting in one other area. We even have people who are acting in two other areas, and this is one person. So that's a space where I found Stats SA in terms of the financial resources and in terms of the human resources. Of course, engagements remain ongoing with the National Treasury so that we can be able to deal with this issue. And we are amongst other challenges that are there in the state. Stats say, while we are making our point to say we need to be funded, we need to be funded, there are other challenges that the state needs to make resources
How much
available.
do you need to be funded?
If you ask me at the stage that we are seated now, we have always been saying at a bare minimum, if we get about 300 million, we would be able to run our operations a lot more better. And it may look like a lot of money.
Yeah.
But for example, let me give you, the income and expenditure survey alone would cost us about 150 million minimum if we don't do it complete. To do it complete, income and expenditure survey tells us about poverty. This country, since 2015, we haven't been able to go and get information that helps us to measure money metric poverty. So we don't know how many people are poor in South Africa since 2015.
And that's a disadvantage.
We would
to your
need
office.
about 200 million rands to run this survey all the way. You need more than that to actually hire the staff members, since let's say that will fill in and plug the critical areas that we need positions in. So if you have about that, we would need that, but that's a minimum we need. We might even need a lot more going up on the upper end, because the challenges that we have to fill. We are losing about 100 staff members per annum. Actually, when I came in, we were losing about 100 staff members. We are losing about 116, 118 staff members per annum. And as we lose them, we are not replacing them. So if you don't replace them, it's got a serious bearing on the work that we do. For now, to me, we will continue to do the work of Stats SA the best we can. But in the long term, there will be challenges. But for now, I can tell you, Stats SA is in business in all eternity.
To what disadvantage?
Well, certainly, in the end, there will be challenges. I have no doubt that if we don't address this, we have to address this. Other than that, the fact that since 2015, we are saying that we need to measure unemployment, poverty, and inequality. But at the stage, since 2015, and we are saying as a country, it's not ourselves as Stats SA, since 2015, we haven't conducted the income and expenditure survey that should help us to make the poverty numbers available. And in this regard, we can't tell you how many people are poor. When you ask us how many people are poor in South Africa, I will tell you 40% of the people in South Africa are poor. And we will always tell you, as of reference, 2015. And obviously, official statistics have a reference. The last survey you conducted is the one that must guide you. Like the census, obviously, you can't run the census every year.
Yeah.
Costs us about 10 billion rands, and not 3 billion rands to conduct a census, the one that we conducted in 2011.
Yes.
Now, when you talk about 3 billion rands, if you were to, we do it every 10 years, but if we were to do it every 5 years, it will actually not only be very costly for the nation, but it would come at a heavy bearing on the organization, because census is not the only work we do in Stats SA.
That then we have an upcoming census. How are you tackling that one?
Well, we are looking at different approaches, a multimodal approach that we will use for data collection. For example, we are looking at computer-assisted web interviews. We just ran a test on that. We are also looking at computer-assisted telephone interviews.
Okay.
We are also looking at computer-assisted personal interviews, where we will send our field workers. Of course, with COVID-19 challenging us, we are looking at ways in which we should be able to collect information from the citizenry with minimum contact with members of the public. And in this regard, as we do so, I must admit that we are running a battery of tests as of now to be able to see which methods and which approaches we will use. As we do so, we have in 2016 conducted what we call the community survey using a computer-assisted personal interviews, where we sent our field workers with smart facilities like iPads to go and collect information. We have in KwaZulu-Natal conducted the citizen satisfaction survey using the same approach. So we are actually solid on our march towards Census 2021. All we appeal for is members of the public should readily make themselves available as and when we are testing some of our methods. And we do advertise before we come that we are coming to test this and we're coming to test this. But on the night of the 9th of October, waking up into the 10th of October 2021, Stats SA, field workers from Stats SA, either in person or remotely through telephones and using the facilities that we have, will be flooding the country to collect information about where South Africans live and where they live and play.
Will you be wearing a specific color?
Statisticians are not measured by the color of the cloth that they don. I know that there's been a lot of talk in the yellow color of Stats
Oh,
SA.
yeah.
But that was a color that we adopted for the previous census. And indeed, the color for the next census is green. So we are going to see a lot of green.
Okay.
But I must admit, statisticians should be measured by how much independent they stay from the policy space and always continue to change the numbers without fail to keep the nation informed rather than what cloth they don.
I'll tell you a personal story about the census. The last time we had a census, someone knocked on my door and asked for the adults, and I was the adult. It's 7 p.m. We continue this conversation with the Statistician-General, Tatani Risenga Maluleke, straight after the news bulletin at 7 p.m.
In your top stories this hour, Statistician-General Risenga Maluleke says it's important that his office has its independence, and the Jacob Zuma legal team is set to review Zondo Inquiry's recusal ruling. Good evening, Amananda Homo. Statistician-General Risenga Maluleke says it's important that his office is independent from any external interference. He's currently in conversation with Tumisang Ndlovu on power business on a variety of issues, including policy formulation and how stats can be used to forecast the next year. He says due to the mandate of the office, which includes making recommendations to government on the policies and priorities of Statistics South Africa, it needs to be far away from interference. Maluleke adds that though there are times when statisticians are stressed and asked to dabble in the policy space, it shouldn't happen.
In as much as the Statistician General takes advice, the independence and integrity of the numbers is very critical. So the numbers, when we make them available, you cannot have pre-sight from any person. And if you look, we're a government department, and then the times with matters of government, you usually see that they get discussed at the ministerial level or at the level of a cabinet before a statement is issued. It's not the same with statistics. We have about 250 to 270 products per annum. Almost every day we have a product going out. And in that regard, they must be released independent to maintain integrity.
Maluleke also spoke on the mandate of the office, saying it's important that the office serves all South Africans in totality.
Policymakers in the form of parliamentarians and politicians and those in the executive, as well as leaders and captains of industry, they see the numbers the same time as members of the public see them. And that maintains the independence.
It's seemingly all systems go for the strike at the SABC tomorrow. This follows failure by management to accede to workers' demands to abandon the retrenchments of 400 employees at the state broadcaster. Led by the Communication Workers Union, workers have threatened a complete blackout. Employees picketed outside the Auckland Park premises today, along with members of COPE, EFF and the ANC Youth League, among others. The workers want the already issued retrenchment notices withdrawn and an alternative to the impending job cuts. The union's Aubrey Shabalala maps the way forward.
We did not expect them to respond, to be honest. That's why we are preparing to go for all manner of all strikes. Gave the 48-hour notice, which is defined by law, which basically kicks on at 12 midday tomorrow. It's a comprehensive approach that we are taking. Firstly, due to pressure of workers that we've been mounting on both the executive and the board, we have seen the splits now. Some board members are distancing themselves. They are indicating that they were not privy to the briefings and the alternatives that the union has been given.
And former President Jacob Zuma's legal team has denied that the move to walk out of the Zondo Commission this afternoon was motivated by disrespect. Zuma and his legal representative Moses Kakane walked out of today's proceedings shortly after Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo announced the dismissal of the application for his recusal. Zuma was summoned to answer questions related to allegations of fraud and corruption levelled against him following numerous no-shows. In response, he raised issue with the independence and fairness of the Commission's chairperson, citing a personal relationship between them. Eric Mabuza, who forms part of the legal team, was on Power Drive earlier.
Mr. Tikakane respectfully asked the DCJ to be excused. Not only that, but we also, subsequent to that, we went to chambers to inform the DCJ courteously that our instruction is not to come back. So there was absolutely no disrespect whatsoever.
Shortly after the walkout, Zondo addressed the Commission, indicating that Zuma had departed without permission.
It is a pity that he has elected to leave without asking for permission. There is no point for the Commission to sit for the rest of the day because it had convened to deal with his evidence. There is no point in coming tomorrow because he's not coming back.
A cool and fine day expected across Gauteng tomorrow. Temperatures to peak at 25 degrees in Johannesburg, 27 in Pretoria and 26 in Vereeniging. Recapping the top story in Power News this hour, Statistician-general Risenga Maluleke says it's important that his office is independent from any external interference. He's currently in conversation with Tumisang Ndlovu on Power Business on a variety of issues.
On your roads in the city of Johannesburg, still seeing a bit of slow-moving traffic on the M1 South. So this is coming all the way from Parktown, going past Empire Road until you get to the Johannesburg CBD at the Crown Interchange. Also, just be on the lookout in the city of Ekurhuleni. Some roadworks taking place, which are affecting the flow of traffic. So this is on the N12 heading west as you're going past Kingsway in Davidson. Just a bit of minimal delays. Please approach with care.
Power News.
Power Business with Tumisang Ndlovu. Monday to Thursday, 6 to 8 p.m. and Fridays, 6 to 7 p.m. on Power 98.7.
Welcome back to the special edition of On the Money Talks right here on Power Business on Power 98.7. Of course, we are also live on our sister station, that is Capricorn FM, in partnership with Mail and Guardian as well, in conversation with the Statistician-general of South Africa, Risenga Maluleke. At this point, we're going to take questions, which we haven't. We've had a good hour, and we've gotten much, if not more, than what we were hoping for from the Statistician-general. It's not every day that we are graced with such presence. Tahila Nisilo, my colleague, what questions do we have?
Good evening, Tumisang, and good evening, Mr. Maluleke. Well, there's been a flood of questions on the various platforms, on the webinar jam, Twitter, as well as calls. And I think one of the biggest themes of this evening is everyone is feeling the pinch, and this really came through in the questions that we received. Kagiso from Centurion asking what the numbers in the consumer, in the CPI report, and even the way that you compile the basket of goods show about the socioeconomic conditions in the country.
And that's where the real economic questions come from, because we have to look at our own pockets. Why I asked earlier how stats data affects you and I as ordinary citizens, it's in our pockets, but there's a disconnect. How do we measure CPI and how does it affect all of us?
Firstly, we have what we call a basket of goods and services. So people acquire electricity, for example, from the municipalities, or they buy bread and milk every day. So there has to be a basket of goods and services. But how do we get this basket of goods and services? We are going out from time to time in what we call the income and expenditure survey. And as we go out in the income and expenditure survey, we understand what South Africans are spending on. And once you have an understanding of what they are spending on, then you are able to look at the weight of what they are spending on and come up with what you call the basket of goods and services. So you are talking about 400 goods and services that you have to come up and say, this is where they are spending. And once you know that, you have to track those prices from the shop floors. So we get the prices from the shops, from the stores, as well as from time to time from service providers. For example, when you look at the expenditure that goes to mobile telephones and data, we have to get them from there, because those prices, half the time, the people will not know. They will know what they are spending on, but they won't know the price changes. We have to get the information from those. And you look at when they are spending on school fees and the like. Now, when you have gotten that, you have to monitor that monthly. That's why the consumer price index comes out monthly. Now, there is what we call the micro level, where it relates to me and you as a person. When we look at the inflation in the way it goes and how it affects our life in terms of negotiation for salaries and all the issues. But there's also the macro level, where the governor of the Reserve Bank, and coincidentally today, has come back and say the repo rate is sitting at this level. And they use these numbers from time to time. They use the inflation numbers that we make available, the CPI numbers, to be able to say this is where we will keep the repo rate for purposes of those who want to go and take loans with the banks, as well as for purposes of those who want to invest to know what their yield will be. So that's how the CPI works.
What do we spend most on in South Africa, particularly on the food basket side of things?
We must expect that it varies from time to time, but you should know that areas like where people are using bread and milk on daily basis, rice is one of those that they are spending. But let me mention also that in the collection of the data, we collect from different areas, about 21 regions, or 21 or 29 regions that we are collecting on from the side of your urban centers, as well as your areas that are not necessarily urban. So you have to collect from everywhere so that you have a representative way of the data that you are making on the CPI. Of course, there's a lot to improve going forward.
Absolutely. Tahila, I'm sure the quarterly labor force survey or unemployment rate is another question.
Of course, yes. There was a question there about the quarterly labor force survey, as well as the GDP figures, and about actually Marcus from Rustenburg asking how these figures are put together. Of course, they seem very complex to people who are not in the stats field.
Let us start with the quarterly labor force survey, and it speaks to our previous discussion before we took a break, that there is information that we collect from the households. So the quarterly labor force survey, and it's not the only survey on employment that we make available. We have another one, quarterly employment survey, the QES, that comes from the factory gates. But this one, the quarterly labor force survey, we collect information from the household. So we knock at your door. We have a sample representing about 30,000 households. And of course, during the COVID times, there were limitations of reaching out to those households. But as we do so, we come and knock at your door. Previously, we used to knock at your door and talk to you about who is employed, who is not employed. Once we know who is employed, we want to know which industry they are working in. And those that are not employed, we want to know how long have they been unemployed, because we need to define long-term unemployment in terms that they spend 12 months or more not being employed. And if they are not employed, that they, before we talk of someone not employed according to the International Labour Organization guideline, being that they must be actively looking for employment. If they are not, then they form part of what you call your discouraged work seeker, or they form part of what we call other not economically active, because the discouraged work seeker is also not economically active. They may be students. As you know, we have always been asked, but you include young people as young as 15 years. We don't make the laws, we only go and measure. If you go to the basic conditions of employment act in South Africa, I think it's section 43(1)A. It tells us that it's illegal in South Africa to hire anyone younger than the age of 15, meaning that anyone from 15 years can take up employment unless they are a student or for whatever reason they are not able to work. Now, on the GDP is not a collection. It's not like when we go and knock and say, tell us what you are doing on industry on this. We have, the GDP is a compilation in the form of what we call national accounts. So we do a compilation based on our monthly releases that come, be it electricity, gas, utilities in the form of electricity, gas, and water, be it what happens in manufacturing, in finance, in all areas, trade and the like. And out of that, we make the final compilation to be able to look at the weight of firstly, the rate at which each industry is performing and the contribution that it is making. And once we have done so, we are able to come up with the final figure to say this is the rate at which our economy is growing. Of course, in the last quarter, there were issues that were raised because we said if you look at the seasonally adjusted number, it was negative 51, where everyone said, no, Stats SA cannot be measuring right. Stats SA doesn't change its methods based on whether there's coronavirus or not. We have continued to make the number as seasonally adjusted and, of course, annualized. And nobody has raised an issue. Now, when the number comes back very big, everyone wants to ask a question. And we say, when we look at annualized and seasonally adjusted, we assume things are the same. But we also made the number available where we say, remember, when you don't, if you are unadjusted, the economy fell by 16.4%. We always make these numbers available. And it's only during trying times that any system can be tested to the limits. And in this regard, on the number of the negative 51 growth as well as the 16.4 fall, that is where we were tested to explain our methods, and we'll continue explaining them.
Tatani, there's often a question around what in South Africa is termed the labor force that is not accounted for as formal. And we sometimes do not collate that. Why is that? The informal sector, whatever that may mean in the South African landscape.
Firstly, if you look at our labor force survey, we will always talk about what is happening in the formal sector, as well as what is happening in the informal sector, what is happening in agriculture, what is happening in private households. And it is easy when you go to households because you talk to people. We are already talking about the word informal. Informal, as the word stands, is how informal they are. It's very difficult to get hold of them and account for them. Having said so, it is not enough a reason for any statistical agency not to be able to find innovative ways to reach out to them. But I must admit that from the household side, especially from our quarterly labor force survey, we always make these numbers available. We can readily say that out of those that were employed in the second quarter, about 3.1 million came from the informal sector as of the third quarter of 2020. So we always look at that.
That's interesting. Any more, Mama?
Yes, Mr. Maluleke, you mentioned the importance, of course, of the GDP figures. Those are always the headlines as well as unemployment. But we have Tumi from Soshanguve asking, what is the importance of the mining and manufacturing data? Why must we as South Africans care about these numbers? Because only a few people play in these industries.
Firstly, how many people play in an industry? And of course, when you talk about South Africa, the whole issue of a population group as to whether these people are black or white will always come in. But that's a history we find ourselves in. And that narrative of South Africa talking about black and white will always be there. So we have always said statistics do not have to have taste buds. We can't be saying that because there are few people playing in that space, we can't measure. But if you look at mining, for example, and manufacturing, they churn out amongst the biggest. When you look at nominal GDP, for example, manufacturing comes as number 4 in the country. Its share of nominal GDP is in the region of about 15%. Actually, prior to 1994, it was the number 1 or the number 2 industry in South Africa. It's sitting at number 4. So if its share of nominal GDP is 15%, in terms of what gets produced, in terms of volumes, as well as what finances go through that system of manufacturing, you cannot not measure it, regardless of how many people play in that space. So is mining. And if you look at mining, for example, it's usually sitting in the space of about 8% as a share of nominal GDP. But the volumes that come from there in the form of production, the rate at which your sales are going have to be managed, because if you don't manage, if you don't report on that, you will be failing in a larger chunk of the country. Speaking of industries, by the way, we always see that their share of nominal GDP, the area where agriculture is, agriculture's share of nominal GDP is about 3-4%. In the last quarter, actually, it was 4%. But what is happening, its share of employment is 5.5%. Look at the share of construction. The share of construction is sitting at about 10%, not more than 10%. But its return on the number of those that are employed is always going higher, so it contributes a lot more. And so is trade. Trade, its share of the number of people it employs, it's about 15% or slightly above that from time to time. So all these sectors, regardless of who plays in them, who has the ownership, have to be measured at all times, because not only does South Africa wants to know, we also want to always say, how do we compete with other nations, especially emerging economies like ours?
Absolutely. What more has come out, though, Tahir?
And quite an interesting question here, Tumisang, from Tando from Santon. Has COVID-19 resulted in any unique data for South African individual households and businesses? I know that you include those in the unemployment figures. And what new information are we now privy to? And can we move this forward in planning for better service delivery?
Firstly, from the side of the economy and the side of labor markets, that's not where we talk about service delivery. We have what we call general household surveys, that's a say, where we talk about services and the form of service delivery right at the municipal level, at the personal level, and everything. But you cannot say from the side of the economy, from the side of employment, as well as from the side of the GDP, that you are not talking about services, because those industries provide employment. Speaking of COVID-19, one of the things that we have already spoken of in the previous session is that we could not go out to talk to members of the public in person. But look at quarterly labor force survey, for example. What we have found out is that about 89% of people were supposed to continue to work. Whether they worked from home or not is immaterial, but had to work even during the highest level of COVID-19 lockdown. And when you look at that, we went down to say, of those who were working, who were those? Managers, professionals, as well as people in the technical space were working from home, whereas people like in agriculture, people in private households had to go, and domestic workers had to go to work. You can't work, you don't have an iPad to work from home. But not that alone. We had to look at how many people continued to earn full salaries. About 89.9% in the last quarter and in the third quarter. And in the second quarter, it was 89.7%. Almost 90% of the people continued to earn full salaries, while a smaller chunk of people, but in volumes, it's a percentage, but in volumes, it's more. They didn't earn their full salary. But not only that, those who are less educated earned a lot more lesser than those who are educated in the form of graduates.
That continues to be a problem in the data that we receive. And at an emotional level, I will admit that the number of uneducated as a labor force that we absorb in South Africa is quite concerning. And therefore, it brings in the gender dynamics of who gets employed in South Africa. Again, black women are at the back of the queue. At what point do you see the data changing since you've been in office? Is there even the slightest of slow progression there?
Well, you are saying you have an emotional attachment to the numbers. The statistician-general, and indeed those in official practice, will never be attached to numbers. We just make numbers available. But we know that young people in South Africa are vulnerable to labor markets. So are women, particularly black African women. If you look at the unemployment rate for young people between first quarter and second quarter and third quarter in 2020, it has increased by 9 percentage points to about 61.3%, which is far higher, almost 30 percentage points higher than the national average. And if you look, and we are talking young people 15 to 24 years, but you also have young people 15 to 24 years. In the nation, we have about 10.3 million of those. 3.3 million are not in employment, education, or training. But the last point that I want to come to, as regards women particularly, is that the unemployment rate for all population groups, be it white, Indian, colored, is below the national average. It's below the 30.8% that we released. The unemployment rate for black Africans is sitting at about 34.2%. And out of that, for black African women, it's sitting at 36.3%, which is far higher than the national average. And when you look at that, and you look at the labor markets, for example, you can readily say that young people, and indeed black African women, followed by colored women, are vulnerable to labor markets. But it's not only in labor markets, in all aspects of life. When you talk about poverty, your black African women is left far behind, so are young people. What are people earning in terms of gender parity in South Africa, for example? In South Africa, women earn 78% of what men are earning. And of course, the graduate women are the ones that are better. They earn 92% of what men are earning. And if you look at in terms of those that are not educated, for example, with no education, they earn about 53% of what their male counterparts are earning. And if you look at the provinces across the nation, those women in Limpopo earn far much less than their male counterparts than anywhere in the country. Unemployment affects people in the Eastern Cape the most. It's the highest, both in official terms and in expanded terms. When you expand unemployment, looking at those that are not actually are discouraged and those who didn't look for employment but would have taken up employment, it's sitting at more than 50% in the Eastern Cape. So Stats SA will always continue shining the light on where the numbers are. Whether things are working or not working, we don't have taste buds. Our job is to make the numbers available.
I'm glad you don't have to have the taste buds, we do. I must thank you immensely, Nkomo, for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I trust that our viewers and listeners enjoyed this half an hour. It's an hour and a half, way more than we had anticipated, and we got a lot from the Statistician-General of South Africa. Stay tuned after the break. We get into a panel discussion dissecting all that has come out this evening on Power Business.
It's a crisis, they scream. Grab what you got and go. Sell up. Cut your losses. Run for the hills. And, tempting as it may sound, often the best thing to do is to stop. Stop and count to 5. Stop and catch your breath. Stop and think. The logic is simple, yet very effective. And it prevents the one thing you should always avoid. Panic. Because panic is what can turn a temporary loss into a real one. It's why we never allow the mood of the day to influence the way we invest for tomorrow. Because a great long-term decision made calmly will always outlast an emotional one. Ellen Gray, long-term investing. Ellen Gray is an authorized FSP.
What makes me a creator of tomorrow? Tomorrow holds a lot of unknowns, and I'm willing to experiment to create new ways to tackle these unknowns.
Nihal Somers is a Dimension Data Graduate Accelerate Program alumni, now working with us as a digital strategist.
My real passion is honestly about humanizing technology. I would like to influence and disrupt the current way in which technology is taught from an educational standpoint. That's that powerful human connection that we can create by using technology for the good.
Dimension Data believes technology has the power to shape a better future, which is why we created our Graduate Accelerate program and other youth development programs to help our brightest young minds become the creators of tomorrow.
The gap year really taught me about bridging the gap between textbook knowledge and practical knowledge.
That was quick, guys. Delivery done.
Hey, sort of, sir. Delivery of goods taken by writers, Mr. Mbete.
You guys okay?
Yeah, but...
All's well that ends well.
Sasria has an amazingly soothing effect when your goods become collateral damage to riots and strikes. Sasria's unique special risk cover is like turning back time. Business is restored to what it was before. For more information, contact your broker or insurer today. When things go bad, Sasria makes good. Sasria is an authorized FSP. T's and C's apply.
Old Mutual on the Money offers local employers and trade unions access to free virtual financial education workshops for their staff, packed with practical tips to help their employees manage their personal and family finances as smartly as possible. Email financialeducation@oldmutual.com to book your free workshop today. Old Mutual Life Assurance Company SA Limited is a licensed FSP.
This special Power Dialogue is proudly brought to you by Old Mutual's On the Money program. Old Mutual Life Assurance Company SA Limited is a licensed FSP.
Thank you so much for staying with us right here on Power Business as we get into the final leg of the special edition of the Old Mutual On the Money Talks in partnership with Power 98.7. We are also live on our sister station Capricorn FM as well as on the Power 98.7 YouTube channel. At this point, after speaking to the Statistician-General, Risenga Maluleke, we are joined by Lumkile Mondi as well as Kholiso Malindi right here on stage, and on line is Andrew Davison. Thank you so much for giving us your time.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
Budlumkile,
Thanks.
ngizawuqala ngawe.
Welcome.
You've been sitting there, and I'm sure there are so many questions that you would have wanted to ask. And in this panel, it is the time for you to get into the grips of what it is that we spoke about with the Statistician-General. What stands out for you from a perspective of that disconnect that we may find as the cash-strapped South African consumer, as well as the data that is collated and we are told about ourselves?
Firstly, let me just make a comment coming from your discussion with the Statistician-General. That is, through the work that he and his team are doing, we are very much able in South Africa to predict a toddler born at a particular province, what will happen to that toddler when she turns 7 years. And basically because you know that particular province, that toddler probably will drop out and will be just one of the numbers. So through the work that they do, it's really giving us amazing information, which in fact then, because we've got taste buds, unlike him, we've got taste buds, we look at the beast, where this society is going.
Yeah.
So there is that, but the second one relates to what we perceive, some of us who are watching and use this data, a hollowing out of an institution such as Stats SA. We've seen many of our institutions being hollowed out, but here, through squeezing it, by not funding it, we are then able to disempower us to ask questions and to make policymakers and politicians to account for the evils and the ills of our society. So just in conclusion, to give someone else, to give others a chance. Therefore, the fact that there's cutting of the budget, it means basically that now we're not doing any income and expenditure survey. As explained, that you know what, when people ask him about poverty, he refers to the 2050 number that he thinks is 40%. So what it means basically that for us at institutions of learning, so without income and expenditure survey, and the impacts on the national income and income dynamics surveys, etc. So it means that where we're able, through the work done by StatSA, to go at low level, follow certain households over a period, through the income expenditure survey and other work, that empowerment is now gonna go away. So you wonder, the policymakers have told us about poverty, inequality, and unemployment, the triple ills or evils, whatever I call them. How are we going to resolve them when you're killing the institution that makes us, who are voters, to be cleverer, to make them account, but more importantly, to make that important voter decision when election comes?
Absolutely. Sis Kholiso, I don't ask this of you solely because you and I are women and we have taste buds. I ask you this in that, as a black South African economic participant and a woman in this economy, we are very far. We are not doing, something is not to make sure in the incorrect English, and we are not fixing it. Stats SA tells us this data all the time, but policy is not changing. There still is no deliberate attempt to fix that economical ill. And when Upudlumkile talks about the 3 triple challenges, at no point is there a female direction there. How do you respond to that? How do we as a South African public respond to that?
Thank you, Tumi, for that. And thank you, Stats General, for the presentation. This is a very tricky one. To me, it's very tricky because the data is disseminated to the public, and that data is supposed to be informing the policy decisions in the country. So the question is, to what extent then do policymakers interrogate the data that's being made available? And if they do understand the data that's being made available, how do they respond if they do? Because we are not sure. Now we're talking about that the data would show that this is the situation, and on the other hand, we don't see any actions in terms of trying to address the problem that the data is revealing. So the question then is, what is the point then if we are to have an institution that provides us with the data, but then we don't see any response, policy responses to the data that's being, distributed. So I think that for me is a concern, particularly for us females, because I feel like there is no sufficient opportunity for us that's being open for us out there, because my main view is that maybe the policy makers are not that responsive to the data that's being provided.
Let's get a financial view. Andrew, good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for joining us. And for an insurer, for a financial service, how do you respond to statistical data that tells you about a consumer that is struggling in an economy that is dwindling?
Yes, that's, for us, the data is so important, not just from a business point of view, in terms of managing our business, but because, as you say, we're a financial services company. So what we're trying to do is make sure that the products that we make available are addressing the needs that people have. So we need to really respond to the data and make sure that when we're designing a new product or when we're looking at an existing product, we are making sure that it is really addressing the need. And an example is inflation. Obviously, inflation is such a challenge when we're saving, because if we don't beat inflation in terms of our investment return, we're actually going backwards in terms of our spending power of that money that we've saved. So we have to always be worried about what is inflation doing. And it's not just inflation at the CPI level, as Risenga Maluleke chatted about earlier. Every one of us in the room has actually got a different personal inflation rate.
Yeah.
They measure the economy or the temperature of the stats as a whole in the nation. But we actually have to determine, if we're making a product available to pensioners, is their inflation rate a good measure, is CPI a good measure in that space? Or do we actually need to look at a slightly different take on the data? And thankfully, we've got a lot of information that is included, but it's not always the headline number. But you've got to look beyond that, and that's, I think, what people often miss.
Budlumkile, that's where I want to rope you in there. There's enormous data. There's a lot of work that is done by the statistical body that is Stats SA. But when it comes to policy level, and unfortunately I must ask the uncomfortable questions, in that there's a trust deficit in South Africa. There is a disconnect when we have to talk about what is needed. From a financial perspective, we are talking about tailor-made solutions, tailor-made products that are going to meet you and I at retirement at different inflation levels. Is policy speaking to an individual in South Africa, even with the big data that we have?
It does. I think the challenge, as we've debated a number of times, is really the consistency and follow-through around our interventions. So to the extent that every 5 years, there is, despite that the same political party, the message keeps on changing. So we're not able to sit on a particular policy trust and follow through. Use the data that's coming out from Status A to see how we have performed. The monitoring evaluation that Risenga was talking about, use that to say this policy is very blunt because in the past 5 years, using the data from Status A, this is our intervention. And this is what we're seeing coming out. Therefore, let's sharpen it or change tag. Ours not changed because of that lessons learned from monitoring and evaluation. It's changed due to political expediency. So that's really the challenge of South Africa, that the political masters are so, have such very, very interesting tongues, which are sweet and which are about them, that they just love the sugar that comes out of it. And in the process, miss out staying through the process of intervening and learning from the interventions that they're doing and changing and amending the policy in achieving what goals that we set ourselves to do.
Another divide, Sis Kholiswa, is that South African citizenry, based on the statistical data that comes out, there's a huge group of the community in South Africa that is uneducated. And when we have to deal with that uncomfortable situation, we have to deal with whether is there an understanding of, number one, statistical data relating to policy that comes up. Number three, directly tangible job creation. How do we disseminate that information as a flow?
I think here, to me, the problem, in my view, and probably being in classes where I've been in contact with students who have we're postgraduate school, but then you find that you have students who have no statistical knowledge at all. So at that level, then one wonders what happens if you have people at those levels who have no statistical knowledge at all, how much more then for people, and ordinary citizens in the rural areas, and how are they then expected to understand this information? And for instance, on one hand, we say this information, this data is provided so that we can, to some extent, hold our government to account, right? So the question now is, when we have such situations where data is being distributed and our citizens understand nothing when it comes to statistics, they cannot analyze, they cannot, they just know nothing, or in fact, it scares them away.
Yes.
Yeah, so the question then is, what can we do? I don't know if there's a way where we can actually simplify, or if not simplify, find ways of ensuring that even an ordinary person in the rural areas, in the rural Eastern Cape, for instance, they are at least able to get the basics of that information so that I can let's make informed decisions. Here we're talking about CPI, we're talking about many other things that have a direct effect on them, but then we're talking about people who understand nothing on how these are compiled and what effect they have in their daily, their daily lives. So that for me is a problem, and I think there's a lot that we still need to do, even as the educational institutions. We need to also play our part in this regard, I think, to ensure that at least people are educated, at least at the basic level, just so at least they can have that understanding. Because I feel like for people who are in the rural areas, data is just one of those things that they think has nothing to do with them.
Sure.
Please, I'm bending, as Chris was saying. So one of the fundamental errors, which is a big debate, which we're shying away from, is that we've made data and sciences broadly something out there and foreign, because we have refused to teach South Africans on their own language.
Oh, yeah.
So, ukuba besithetha isiXhosa, asithetha ngenamba Risenga athetha ngazo, sizibeka ngesiXhosa. As Afrikaners do, Afrikaners are empowered. They still speak Afrikaans. So are English people. They still speak English. With a black government that never speaks the language of us. So we need, the education system is a mess. We have to go back and teach these things that are foreign in our languages. So umama, nokuba kanga esikolweni, uzawundiva uba ndithini. So that's really the structural thing that needs to change now. if we're gonna be able to really talk about inequality and how we make sure that people are empowered and can exercise choices. Sorry to me.
I'm glad I don't have to say that because I still have a job to maintain. Andrew, from a financial institution point of view, selling a product is, of course, a language. Selling a product is, of course, a meeting of marriages between an individual and their finances. How then do you put it on paper to say, maybe to one who is going to retire at some point, in a cash-strapped consumer type of dispensation and a landscape in South Africa where the economy is dwindling, how do you then propose it to them? Like Uputlumkile is saying, that if I don't understand the basics, how is it that my financial document is meant to explain this to me? Because for years, we know that most of us don't even read the terms and conditions, which are all the way at the back.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, and it's one of the reasons why we do spend a lot of time and money and effort on educating the public and our customers, because a financial product is quite different to a product that you buy in a store.
Yeah.
That is a physical product. You pick it off the shelf. A financial product is a much more complex thing, and you actually need to understand your needs as the customer in order to properly communicate those needs and have a meaningful conversation with whoever is selling you that financial product to make sure that you make a good choice. And that for us is why we spend time trying to educate people as much as possible about the choices that they've got, about the types of products, about their own needs, because often people aren't even sure what their financial needs are. But just one point I wanted to pick up on around education. For me, the most important thing that is really missing from our school education is that people should come out of school an expert on interest rates. And that might sound like a thing, why would we care about them? But for me, if you don't understand interest, your life is going to be difficult. Because if you don't understand it, you're going to get yourself into debt. You're going to pay a lot more interest than you earn because you don't understand the implications of a loan. You don't understand the benefits of compound interest. So for me, if there's one financial topic that we should spend a lot of time on in schools, it's interest rates and understanding them well, because they are such an important life skill.
Putlumkile, on the part of state institutions when it comes to economic data, in your view, in current day South Africa, we are now in a global pandemic and the economic effects come at a time where we were already in technical recession. How closely should the Office of National Treasury, the Presidency, as well as Stats SA should be working?
They're working very closely. I mean, the input, Risenga was explaining to us, that, his is to provide data to everyone. So they take what they need and use it to make policies. He's very clear that he's not going to influence the process. So I'm happy with the arrangement, social arrangement. I think where everything is missed is it's a political economy question, which is my passion. So the political economy question is about power and agency. So if the political agenda of a governing party is to stay in power forever, it is in their interest to keep the status quo because it serves them. So in this case, arguably, it's an argument I'm posing, that the data that's produced then is being used to sustain and keep them in power, not to do the things that they produce and tell us what's happening. So that's a challenge. It's a political economic issue, and it's not our own government only doing it. It's global. So we talk today about the relative truth. You guys call it false news. That's the world. So you use data to kumamanga, just to misrepresent what is happening, because you want to attain, using your power, you want to achieve certain goals, and you let the sleeping dogs lie. And he's not, because his data doesn't lie. It's there, but those that pick it up, they use relative truth to dispense to the general population.
How then, Sis Kolisa, do we use statistical data for financial literacy in South Africa, if we are clearly not doing enough and there's a gap to do even far more?
I think there we need to have more education around that, because I think the reason why people are not in a position to understand these things is because they do not understand the information. So financial education is one of those important. Hans is saying everyone needs to understand the importance of interest rates. So that information is very much important for people to understand what impact those decisions that they make on a daily basis have on their incomes, on their daily lives, that kind of thing. So financial education for me is important, and that begins with understanding simple data, right? So they need to understand simple data, be able to understand and calculate those basic things. That basic, be able to extract that basic information out of the data that's being provided. So failing to do that, then it means there is no way that we can get to a point where we say we are making these decisions and yet we don't understand what impact those decisions have on our future expenditures, on our incomes, on everything that we do. So financial education is key, but then again, the basis there is data, because for you to understand the impact of acquiring more debt, you need to understand what impact it will have on those. Those are the basic things that one needs to understand. That's my view.
Andrew, based on what Sis Kolisa has just mentioned, how much has the term financial literacy changed when it comes to a financial institution seeking to speak to a public about their needs financially?
So, I think it has changed in the sense that, first of all, there is a much greater awareness that education matters. Back in the day, it was much more, you just needed to sell the products. It wasn't essential for the customer to understand them. You understood them as the salesperson, and it was much more of, there's that old adage, life insurance isn't bought, it's sold. And that was very much the way of thinking a couple of decades ago. But now it's much more around the person needs to understand what their need is. We need to help them understand that need. Then we need to work out which product makes most sense for that need. But the financial education is a challenge. We really do. We do a lot, and we still feel as though we're not making enough difference. So I certainly don't want to say that all of these programs and all of this money that we're spending is making sure that everyone knows what they need to. Sometimes it is a problem because there isn't the right base of knowledge to build on. So, if you don't understand basic maths and basic probability, it's quite difficult to now come with the complexity of an annuity as a difficult product. And yet everybody who gets to retirement really needs something like an annuity, which gives you that monthly pension. And yet it's a very difficult concept to try to explain to people when they don't really have the basics. So it is important to get the basics right, and then only can you build the additional layers on top of that.
As an economist, Budlumgil, have we moved from the stereotypical financial products based on the data that we have of the South African economy from Abu Masngcwabisane education policy, the typical type of financial products that we would get?
So it's very exciting now because the industry is being shaken. So the development of the new scholarship called behavioral economics, where we're able to really know you, what you do, where you shop, what things you like, etc. And then model these products that is talking about to suit you is making things much easier now. So I think through behavioral economics and artificial intelligence and data science, we'll be able, at least those that are saving, to really advise them and teach them better than we've done in the past, because you know that behavior. If you can't do siyazi uthanda izinto, so we'll make sure that we do a product that matches you, but you still save. You don't go deeper and deeper into debt. So it's really some progress. You can see the competition to our sponsor today is coming up with that, because it's seen that, based on either the health data or any other forms of data, it's able to exploit and take and chap some of the market that our sponsor is having using the behavioral economics tools and artificial intelligence.
Sis Kolisa, I loved what you said earlier about starting the educational journey of finances based on the data that we are receiving from Stats SA at a very young age. How soon can one start? I have an 11-year-old, and Shem, his money managed skills are not like mommy's.
I guess it should start at a very young age. At a very young age, because I've seen grown-ups not knowing when. I'm going to refer again to his point where he says everyone needs to understand the importance of interest. Yeah. So you'll have people who don't understand when to buy a car. When they say interest rates have increased, is it now time for me to buy a car? I mean, they don't have that kind of knowledge as to when and when not. When not to buy. So I think financial education needs to start at a very young age, right? When you say, for instance, if I give you, we call it umkeromos, right?
Yes.
Yes. So when we give them that kind of money, so we then have to then teach them that if you have to save, for instance, for a present or a gift during for your party's birthday or whatever, then save a little bit from this. So it should start small. I mean, while they're still young, so that when they grow up, they know the importance of saving. Out of the little that you have, you need to start there. You don't wait until you think I have a salary of 20,000 rands, then now I can save. But then it needs to start with the little that you have. Then, I mean, by the time you get there, you're good to go.
Andrew, are you seeing that with the economic participant as a client to Old Mutual, that we are starting early? I mean, most of us in this room have references of maybe having a bank account at the ages of less than 10, but times have changed. They have bank accounts before they're born.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that is a positive trend. I think people are realizing that they need to start educating their kids as early as possible. I do think that is valuable. The one thing that is a bit tricky, I mean, it's a little bit like your kids in exercise as well, is you've got to gently encourage them. If you force them, they actually build up a resentment. I think the same applies to good savings habits. You need to encourage them, give them understanding, let them see the benefits by helping them to obviously do that saving. I mean, if I take my son, I seem to be teaching him about debt because he's always borrowing money. He's not actually normally saving too much. So I'm hoping that I'm going to first teach debt and then I'll get on to saving. But it is a tricky one in practice. But what we are seeing is that young people are very serious about their finances and they're serious about knowledge. And thankfully, they're also very adept at finding knowledge online. The problem online, as you know, is there's too much information. So then it becomes, how do you filter all of this knowledge and work it out? So again, it comes down to, unless you understand the basics, all of that information is not that useful.
Absolutely.
You see, the financial literacy part, when it comes to teaching at a young age, Budlumgile, speaks to changing a culture, changing a dynamic. Do we have an outlook in South Africa? If we look at data that tells us that we have a high unemployment rate, we have data that tells us that we are continuously cash-strapped, and over and above that, the outlook for economic recovery post-COVID-19 is unknown.
Well, it's generational. I think Generation Z is different internationally. These kids are the same because they are in that gadget of theirs, they're in the global space, unlike us. So they're the same everywhere you go. To England, parents will tell you similar issues that Andrew was talking about. So we have to accept that, this is a different generation. But that doesn't stop us from really, as parents, to share our experiences and guide them and play our parental role.
Sis Collis, as a parting shot, Where are the gaps? Where do we need to tighten and do the nuts and bolts when it comes to speaking to statistical data that speaks to policy for a generational wealth type of economy in South Africa?
Data plays a very important role. And I think based on the presentation, going forward, I think there's a lot that the Statistics General mentioned, which includes the institution being, should I say, incapacitated in the sense that there's a lot of employees who are leaving the institution. So I think that would have serious implications on the country as a whole, but then to us as individuals within the country. Data is very important. So I think we need to, the institution, if we are to really have timely data that's accurate and that remains to be relevant in terms of addressing our current needs, then we need to make sure that the institution is strengthened such that it's able to give us the information that responds to our current needs, as a nation. Otherwise, we'll end up with in a situation where we are addressing problems in 2025 that were identified in 2020, and by that time, those problems will be long gone because the data is, we are not responsive to these problems because data is not readily available. So I think the important thing here is ensuring that the institution is able to provide timely data, accurate, that responds to our current needs. Like, for instance, now he said for poverty data, the last time the last version was 2015. You can imagine, poverty is one of our socio-economic challenges in the country. So having data that was last collected in 2015, for me, that is a problem. If we, on one hand, we say we want to address these problems, how do we even begin to address problems when we have data that was last collected in 2015? So I think for me, the important thing is ensuring that the institution, yes, it acts independently, but then it needs to be strengthened. And on the other hand, from a citizen's perspective, I think people need to stop thinking data is none of their business. It has very serious implications. People need to at least begin to understand the basics. And then when we do that, if the data is being made available and that data is timely, relevant to our current needs, and on the other hand, we have that basic understanding, then I think that is going to help us and take us somewhere, rather than having a situation where, for instance, there's data, but then people do not understand, because we have situations where we say the citizens should hold government to account. How do we even begin to hold government to account when we don't understand the financial statements that are being provided to us by the municipalities? We can't even say that. We can't even say a thing because we don't understand, right? So there has to be, for me, that balance. We have to be willing to understand at least the basics. We're not saying people should be, experts in statistics, but then there has to be that sort of willingness, because, every time when someone is being exposed, I've seen some of our students, right? When it comes to having to attend a statistics class, they feel like, wow, this really wasn't my...
First year of stats is never a great one.
Yeah, so there's always that. I think people need to, get that mentality out of there, because it is important for them to understand if we really are to go somewhere as a country.
Absolutely. Progress-driven conversations that we have in the hashtag On the Money Talks series right here on Power Business in partnership with Old Mutual as well as Mail and Guardian. We've been live on Power 98.7 as well as on Capricorn FM. Stay tuned to Power 98.7. Up next is Power Perspective.
Employers and trade unions access to free virtual financial education workshops for their staff, packed with practical tips to help their employees manage their personal and family finances as smartly as possible. Email financialeducation@oldmutual.com to book your free workshop today. Old Mutual Life Assurance Company SA Limited is a licensed FSP.
This special Power Dialogue was proudly brought to you by Old Mutual's On the Money program. Old Mutual Life Assurance Company SA Limited is a licensed FSP.
Power News.
In the top stories at this hour, Statistician-General Risenga Maluleke says that the lack of funding delays the progress of the work of his office, and former President Jacob Zuma's legal team has denied that the move to walk out of the commission this afternoon was motivated by disrespect. A very good evening. I'm Numusa Zwane. Statistician-general Risenga Maluleke says that the lack of funding delays the progress of the work of his office. Maluleke was in conversation with Tumisang Ndlovu on a power business this evening. Among other things, he spoke about the need for policymakers to use numbers in policy formulation. Maluleke says it's important that his office is independent from any external interference for the office to provide sound data to government.
This country, since 2015, we haven't been able to go and get information that helps us to measure money-metric poverty. So we don't know how many people are poor in South Africa since 2015.
And that's a disadvantage.
We would
to your
need
office.
about 200 million rands to run this survey all the way. You need more than that to actually hire the staff members in states that will fill in and plug the critical areas that we need positions in.
The SG also says that the office cannot afford to rehire more staff.
The challenges that we have to fill. We are losing about 100 staff members per annum. Actually, when I came in, we were losing about 100 staff members. We are losing about 116, 118 staff members per annum. And as we lose them, we are not replacing them. So if you don't replace them, it's got a serious bearing on the work that we do. For now, to me, we will continue to do the work of Stats SA the best we can.
Transport economist Ofenze Mukwena says that the conflicts in the taxi industry reveal the need to have a body that will regulate the industry. Mukwena says that the body could intervene in the fights between government as well as taxi associations. In October, the National Taxi Alliance withdrew from the Taxi Lekgotla with claims that Transport Minister Fikile Mbalula was acting in bad faith and in favor of Santaco. Yesterday, taxi owners affiliated to the alliance marched to the office of the Transport Minister Fikile Mbalula, demanding that Mbalula deliver on his promise to grant the industry a COVID-19 relief fund. Mokwena spoke to Tabiso Dima on Power Drive this afternoon.
There was also merit, especially through the constitution of Santaco and the recommendations of the National Taxi Task Team, that there is a need for a body that would politically and also administratively have the capacity to lead the industry. But this is in 1996, and that's quite a bit of time, has passed, since then. So the argument does hold, but it will be challenged, especially with stakeholders that have very invested in the status quo as it is.
Former President Jacob Zuma's legal team has denied that the move to walk out of the commission this afternoon was motivated by disrespect. Zuma and his lawyer Moses Kakani walked out of today's proceedings at the State Capture Commission of Inquiry shortly after Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo announced his dismissal of the application for his recusal. Zuma was summoned to answer questions related to allegations of fraud and corruption leveled against him. In response, Zuma raised issue with the fairness of the Commission's chairperson, citing a personal relationship between them. Eric Mabuza, who forms part of the legal team, was on Power Drive this afternoon.
Mr. Tikakani respectfully asked the DCJ to be excused. Not only that, but we also, subsequent to that, we went to chambers to inform the DCJ courteously that our instruction is not to come back. So there was absolutely no disrespect whatsoever.
This is how the Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo reacted to the walkout.
It is a pity that he has elected to leave without asking for permission. There is no point for the commission to sit for the rest of the day because it had convened to deal with his evidence. There is no point in